Hey, Larken Rose here. So I've done recently a number of videos about socialism and communism, and not so recently I've done videos about that too. About how the economic theory is bogus and irrational, and how the way they describe it is completely intellectually dishonest. Now, on the other side of things, you have a bunch of brilliant people writing like monstrous treatises on Austrian economics and the benefits of free trade and private property and capitalism. And we can argue about what that term means. When I say capitalism, like in the good sense, I'm not talking about the corporo-fascism that we have today, where government violence is used to give people advantages, and I'm talking about the exact opposite of that. But anyway, I'm not going to nitpick about the definition of that word today. But there's so many authors, like modern and going back ages, explaining concepts of economics. There's Hazlitt, and there's Milton Friedman, and there's Hayek, and there's Thomas Sowell, and Walter Williams, and there's a million awesome books explaining how things work and why things work the way they do. And it strikes me that for the vast majority of the population, that's kind of unnecessary, or at least would be unnecessary if we were in a free society. If you go about your life doing what you're doing and you're walking around doing stuff, you don't need to know like the finer details of how muscles work and different muscle fibers and nerve endings and the nerve conduction of motor nerve control and this and that and the other thing. The fact that some people learn about that and know about that and write books about that and do studies about that isn't really necessary for the vast majority of people to learn. Now, if something goes wrong and you're not sure why your limbs aren't working properly, then it really helps that there are specialists who have been studying and writing about those things for ages. And it strikes me that all the economic theory, whether you're talking Austrian economics or commie silliness or whatever else, it wouldn't matter. In the vast majority of cases, it wouldn't matter at all if there wasn't a ruling class trying to enforce a bunch of stupid ideas on people. Because if you have an actually free society, which we don't and never have, if you have an actually free society, people can try different things. And the laws of physics will still apply, and the laws of economics, it's a little bit weird to call those laws, but that's sort of how people think and how people talk, but you know what I mean. Like, reality is still going to be reality. If you try a dumb idea, if you have some invention that tries to ignore how reality actually works, your invention is going to fail. And if you try some economic setup that ignores reality and human nature and cause and effect and incentive and disincentive and all that stuff, it's going to fail. And you might want to learn the theory ahead of time to figure out if your idea is going to fail or not beforehand to save yourself some time. But the rest of the world doesn't have to care. They don't have to understand the intricacies of why your idea is stupid, because they're not going to be harmed by it if you don't have the power to force it on other people. Likewise, people can do their commie thing and have collectives and whatever they want if there isn't a ruling class with which to force their bad ideas on other people. And the thing is, as soon as there is a ruling class and people are making their arguments in the context of, here is why the ruling class should do it this way or that way, or even here is why the ruling class shouldn't interfere with this, like laissez-faire capitalism. Here's why the ruling class shouldn't interfere. That's still a question of, well, there's this political monster, what should it do? How should it do it? And what shouldn't it do? The fact that there is that debate because people believe in government is why these things matter, when otherwise they wouldn't to the vast majority of people. Because you can go try your ideas, whether they're brilliant or colossally stupid, you can go try them. You don't get to force them on other people, but you can go try them and see how they work out. And you can read the people who explain the principles behind why they do or don't work. You can read it beforehand or after the fact or whatever, but it doesn't matter. Like, I don't have to care how much you misunderstood something about physics when you were making your invention. It just won't work, and it has nothing to do with me, and it doesn't matter. So the first point is just that it wouldn't matter. The economic theory, to the vast majority of people, reality just happens, and whether you understand it or not doesn't really matter. Now, hopefully you're able to adapt. If you try to do something one way and you find out, oh, that didn't work, gee, I wonder why that didn't work. So if people try to do a commune, we're all going to equally own everything, and nobody's really going to own anything individually, and we'll vote on things. And then they try it and go, oh, there still ends up being these little power cliques of this group wants to vote that they get more of this, and suddenly there's this never-ending perpetual argument over who needs what and who gets what, and it turns into a giant mess. Okay, if you want to better understand why bad ideas can turn into a giant mess, then it's useful to have people who think about those things and figure them out and write about them. But if you're not doing that, who cares? You don't need to know why somebody else's plan works or doesn't work. That is true even if you decide to join their plan. If somebody does some arrangement or some plan and it's working well and you go, oh, well, that seems to do what they said it was going to do, maybe I'll join in. I'll go see what it's about and decide for myself whether to voluntarily join the plan or not. And that's perfectly fine. That's how humanity should be. But here's the other thing I wanted to get to. I can't count how many times that I've said and I've heard other voluntarists say that if in a free society without a ruling class, a bunch of communists, like people who call themselves anarcho-communists, want to do their own thing where they are and try that out, we're not going to interfere. We will absolutely allow them the freedom to do what they do with their stuff, and they can organize and arrange their own efforts and their own trade or lack of trade, their own mediums of exchange or lack of mediums of exchange. They get to decide what to do, and I'm not going to interfere. And over and over and over and over and over again, I hear voluntarists and anarcho-capitalists saying, well, we're not going to interfere. We're not going to make you do things our way. In fact, that kind of doesn't mean anything, to make you do things our way, because our way is literally the individual gets to decide what is done with what he does, what he produces, the fruits of his labor. Now, that may include he decides to trade with somebody else, and then what was his becomes that person's, and what was that person's becomes his, or an ongoing like employment relationship where I choose to do this and I get paid this much by that person because we agreed to it. But it's still the individual choosing. So it's impossible by definition to force voluntarism on other people. It's impossible to force anarcho-capitalism on other people because by definition it says that no, the individual is the owner of things. The individual gets to decide what he's doing with what's rightfully his. Now, the closest way you could say that you're going to enforce your values on me is if you made somebody and somebody tries to come steal it. You have the right to say, no, you don't get to steal it, and I'm going to hit you over the head with this board if you don't stop trying to steal my stuff. So in that sense, it is enforced. Property rights are enforced, as in, this is rightfully mine, you don't get to steal it. But that's very different from, I'm going to come over to where you are and impose my idea of how things should work upon you. That is the absolute antithesis of voluntarism. And so I constantly hear voluntarists point out to commies who pretend to be anarchists or claim they're anarchists, well, we're not going to force anything on you. You can do that over there. And I notice that that's almost never good enough for them. Almost never do they go, oh, okay, cool. Then we'll do our thing and you do your thing. I'm trying to remember if I've ever heard an anarcho-communist volunteer and come right out and say, oh yeah, we're not going to mess with you. If you want to do the private property and trade and use money and mediums of exchange and stuff, be our guest. We're not going to forcibly interfere. Now, some will answer that if I ask them, like, if you're doing your thing and we're doing a different thing and we don't want to do that, will you let us do things the way we want? Will you leave us in peace? We're not messing with you. We'll have nothing to do with you. We'll leave you alone. Will you leave us in peace? If I go out of my way to ask, some of them will say yes. And then usually if I follow that up with some questions, their yes gets murkier and murkier. And it's like, well, if some of us successfully build a big place where we make stuff, you can call it a factory if you want, and there are people who get paid to do work there, they're using machinery and equipment that one guy owns or maybe a few guys own, that's their capital, and these people are adding labor and getting paid for it. Are you going to be okay with that, or are you going to come seize the means of production and do the usual commie thuggery thing? And sometimes they say, no, we'll leave that be. But usually it gets really murky all of a sudden because they start saying, well, we think the workers should control that. Okay, well, good for you, but the way it's arranged, they don't. So now what? Are you going to come join the workers to seize the means of production and yada, or are you just going to leave us the hell alone? Often, even the ones who start out by saying, oh, we're not going to force anything on you, then show their true colors that, yeah, if we're doing too well over here in an arrangement that isn't collectivist, at some point they're going to say, you're exploiting the blah, 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 blah. Never mind that everyone involved is choosing to do that. And everyone involved, if they wanted to, could choose to run over to commie land and do things with them instead. So what kind of exploitation is that? That we're not messing with you, we're not stealing your resources, we're not controlling your ability to go out in the world and get natural resources and do what you want with them. But if we arrange things such that there's an owner of capital and there's workers, well, the workers have to own the means of production. Well, do you just mean over where you are, how you're going to arrange things? Because if you want to arrange something like that, we're not going to stop you. And we, the voluntarists, always go out of our way to say we're not going to mess with you. We're not going to initiate force against you. But in the other direction, curiously, you don't really get that often. And when you do get it, when they do pretend that, oh, we'll leave you alone, and you say, well, what if we do really well and you don't? What if there's a bunch of wealth over here? Well, does your need entitle you to what's over here? Your need over there, because your plan was crap and fell apart and was a disaster, does your need suddenly entitle you to what we have? Because to be consistent with communism, it has to. You can't just leave us be. From each according to his ability to each according to his need, what? Unless the ones with ability decide they don't want part of the deal? That's like the entire philosophy is a collectivist view of everybody and all the stuff. How is it going to be controlled and owned or distributed? Well, to be a communist, you can't say from each according to his ability, unless you decide to do things differently, and to each according to his need, unless you decide to do things differently. Like, that isn't anything. It's not a philosophy. It's not applying to everybody. It's just a vague, inaccurate description of how you might choose to deal with what's yours. You and your buddies of however many people are trying out your experiment. If you're not going to apply that to the whole world, it isn't really a philosophy. And if you are going to try to apply it to the whole world, then you're going to have to be a thug. Because according to your philosophy, your need entitles you to it. And if you think you're entitled to it and we have to go seize the means of production because the working class and the bourgeoisie and the yada, 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 blah, 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 the moment you pretend our master plan should be enforced on those people, don't pretend to be an anarchist anymore. Like, however you do that, that is coercion, that is ruling, that is government. That is saying those individuals, what they wanted to do, we don't give a shit. We're going to force our view on them by way of this authoritarian mechanism. And the fact that their rhetoric is like, no, it's for the people and the collective and the common good and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so the guy who shows up with a gun or a club to steal the stuff, Is he the collective? Is he the common good? Or is he just a human being stealing some stuff from some other people? Like the vague, mushy-headed gibberish doesn't change the reality of what you're actually doing. And if you're doing that, you're trying to be rulers. If you're telling other people you don't get to decide for yourself how you're going to trade and how you're going to arrange things and how you're going to deal with each other, we're going to decide for you, that's a ruling class. That's government. That's authoritarian domination, no matter what you want to call it. So it's interesting that the communists, even anarcho-communists, often give themselves away by not just unconditionally starting with, of course, we'll let you do your thing. You can trade, you can have capital, you can have factories, you can do whatever you want. Those of us who want to arrange things this way, we're going to try this over here. Whereas all of the voluntarists I know immediately say, that's fine, we're not going to interfere with you. We may not think it's going to work well, like I don't think it would work well at all. But I'm not the reason it's not going to work well. I'm not going to come mess it up. I just think you're going to mess it up on your own because of how human nature works and laws of economics. But I think it's very telling that communists are always talking about other people being the problem and other arrangements being the problem. They're not just talking about, hey, those of us believe this are going to arrange things in this way and do things this way. Whereas voluntarists, that's all they say. We're going to do things this way, and I'm going to choose this, and you can choose to do that, and we'll see what happens. We don't start with a scapegoat that's minding their own business and say, they're the problem, we have to go attack them and steal their wealth and their means of production and yada, yada, yada. We just talk about, hey, individuals are supreme. Individuals own themselves. They should decide voluntarily who they interact with and how and all that stuff. So you can see just in the general tone and general message and general approach of the collectivists that they don't intend to leave the rest of the world in peace. They don't intend to let other people do their own thing. They intend to have their bad ideas foisted on the rest of society. Now, sometimes they'll do the vague, kind of laughable thing of saying, well, everybody will be educated and you'll all understand what we, the enlightened communists, now understand. And so you'll voluntarily choose it. And if they actually think that and are going to wait around for that but won't force it, okay, I'm fine with that. They're delusional. No, people who actually understand reality are not going to play that game. But if you just hope people are going to get around to agreeing with you, okay, if you're not going to force it. But look at the language they use and look how often their complaint, rent is theft. The perfect example. So there's a guy over there. He's not you. He's not on your property. He's not doing anything to you. He's not forcing anything on you. A guy over there owns a property and says, if you want to live here, you can if you pay this much per month. That's theft. He had nothing to do with you. You have to go to him to have any interaction with him whatsoever. You have to voluntarily go to his property. You have the whole planet to choose from, but you have to go to his property in order for the theft of him offering to rent you a room, in order for that to occur. So to view that as theft, aside from just being insane, is this weird thing that, like, the fact that you exist over there and are offering something to me means you're victimizing me, and I'm going to defend myself and achieve righteousness and fairness by coming and robbing you. And it's the same thing with means of production. Oh, they're exploiting the workers. You mean the workers who went to the factory and said, can I work here? Oh, yeah. So the factory worker didn't, like, go across the countryside and, like, conscript people at gunpoint, unlike what communists actually do when communists get power. They just said, here's a factory. If you want to work here, here's how much I pay for this job. But somehow that counts as them aggressing against you, even though they had nothing to do with you. You wouldn't even have known they were there if you didn't hear somebody else talk about it. They're not victimizing you. They're not victimizing anybody. They're on their own property, and in order to be victimized and exploited by them, you have to go to their property and voluntarily ask. And by the way, if they're victimizing and exploiting you on their property, you know what drastic measures it takes to stop that? Walking off of their property. That's all. They're not holding you there. They're not chaining you to something. They may say, hey, if you're going to work here, you have to actually do the job that we say the job entails. If you don't want to, if you don't want that trade, then you can leave. I'm not keeping you here. I'm not chaining you to a desk. Ew, you're exploiting and victimizing me, even though I could just walk away and you don't do anything. It's ridiculous, but it shows that ultimately, no, the collectivists don't at all want freedom. They don't at all judge morality based on whether somebody is leaving other people in peace. Now, they love to make up ridiculous scenarios and then try to paint the guy with that building, rent is theft. Because what if there's nowhere else to live? Well, does he own the whole planet? I've seen places that rent out property, they don't own the whole planet. They own 0% of the planet. They own this tiny little thing. They say you can live here if you want, if you pay this much. There's lots of planet you can go to that isn't theirs. So to pretend that, I need somewhere to live. There's lots of woods. There's lots of wilderness. Government may very well interfere with your ability to just go claim some natural resources nobody's using. If you want to complain about that, cool. And I'm completely on your side then. Government just declares, this continent's ours. No, it isn't. It's not rightfully yours. But to blame the guy who owns the building for the fact that you can't live in the woods, the guy who owns the building isn't going to follow you into the woods and beat you up because you're not in his room. So to call that exploitation is ridiculous. On the contrary, the commies will absolutely go to him, go to where he is, go to his property and interfere and say, we're defending against your exploitation by stealing your property, stealing a factory, whatever it is, because they don't at all believe in freedom. They don't at all believe in leaving other people alone. Now, occasionally I'll meet someone who calls himself an anarcho-communist, but actually all the way follows through and all the answers are voluntarist. In which case it really is that they believe the individual is sovereign and supreme and the individual gets to decide for himself how he's going to do it. And they would actually peacefully allow people to trade and have employers and employees and hierarchies and voluntary hierarchies and whatever. And they're just going to do a different thing over there. But that is a tiny minority of the people who identify as communists. And the funny thing is, most of them then figure out, I'm actually a voluntarist, because they figure out, whoa, some of these other people who I was associating with who call themselves communists, they don't just want to be left alone. They want to go attack those other people and steal their means of production and their private property unjustly, blah, 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 blah. So they figure out, these other people who wear the label communist, they're not at all about freedom and voluntary interaction. They're about violent thuggery and theft, and they pretend there's a philosophy behind it. So the very few communists who are self-described communists who are actually trying to be moral and leave other people in peace end up being voluntarists and say, well, I just prefer that people arrange things this way. And this is why I complain about anarcho-communists, but also libertarian socialists and a bunch of other categories where it's everybody should be able to choose on their own, but I think people should choose this. Well, it's kind of ridiculous to put those two terms together. Because the first one just means I don't attack anybody else, and the second one is just a personal preference of how you would arrange things if it were up to you. Well, that's not a world philosophy. Even if it's, I think other people should do that too, but they're not going to, and I'm not going to try to force it on them. I'm going to do my thing. So to me, it's sort of ridiculous to stick something on the end of anarcho this or libertarian socialist. If you're not committing aggression against other people, that's the part that I care about. How it's I'm a anarcho person who plants begonias in his front yard. It's okay, good for you. Are you going to force other people to plant begonias? Well, no, of course not. Okay, cool. Why does that have anything to do with this? Why does what you are choosing to do with your life and your property and who you associate with, what does that have to do with I'm not going to commit aggression against other people? It doesn't really. That's just what you choose to do given your freedom. So there are a lot of, you can have the philosophical debate and look at the ideas and go back and forth in the economic theories and stuff. But there are a lot of dead giveaways just in the general ways that communists tend to communicate, where they view themselves as victims of people who, A, never did anything to them, B, never approached them, C, never did anything to their property, and D, they only come into contact with them when the whiny entitlement crowd goes to the property of that person, whether it's a factory or an apartment building that he rents out. It's like, you're oppressing me now that I came to your property and you offered me a deal that I didn't like. That counts as oppression. How childish and incapable of rational thought do you have to be to think the worst oppressors in this world are the people who you have to literally go to their property and then they oppress you by offering a deal you might not like? Well, do they hold you hostage? Oh, no, you can just walk out whenever you want. Whether it's rental, you can just go, okay, I don't want to rent here anymore. If it's a factory, I don't want to work here anymore. They don't make you show up and they don't stop you from leaving, but somehow, that's what's oppressing the world. No, it freaking isn't. As opposed to the collectivists, whether by means of the state or some other authoritarian garbage that they're pretending isn't government, who do go out of their way to force their way on everybody else. The government tax systems don't just say, oh, we're going to tax you if you come to our building. No, we're coming to your building. We're coming to your house. We'll track you down. We're coming to your bank. We'll steal your shit. Because the common good and the collective and the yada, that is collectivism. Collectivism dictates, the whole foundation of it is that it dictates that the rights of the individual don't matter if the collective, the common good is served by stomping all over the rights and property of the individual. So no, they won't leave you alone. An actual collectivist will not leave you alone. And someone who will leave you alone is not a collectivist. Even if they would choose to, participate in some commune or something. And there's a few versions of that seem to kind of work. And like, oh, we'll have a little communal garden and we each have our little plot. And okay, fine. Like, try whatever you want. And as every voluntarist is going to tell you, we're not going to mess with you. But we don't nearly trust you to not mess with us because of the way you talk, because of the way you communicate, because of the way you condemn voluntary interaction as exploitative and theft. Rent is theft. You're using that terminology as an excuse to go to other people's property and steal it from them. And those of us who actually understand the foundation of collectivism instantly recognize them, instantly see that that's what they're about, and instantly see, no, you're not trying for freedom, you're making an excuse to violently impose your bad ideas on the rest of the world. And so, again, the first point I brought up, their bad ideas wouldn't stinking matter if they were the only ones suffering from their bad ideas, if they had no mechanism by which to force their bad ideas on the rest of the world. And that is one more reason why the superstition of political authority and the insane belief in government has to go. Because as long as there's a ruling class there that people think is legitimate, they can argue all day about their various theories of this, that, and the other thing, and beg the politicians to use their power for what they want, and it's always going to end badly. When there isn't that giant, violent, parasitic monster to whine to, most of those whiny commies, they're not going to do anything themselves. They don't have the power, they don't have the ability, they don't have the desire to come rob productive people, who, by the way, can afford to have guns and stuff, and who will absolutely leave the commies alone. You can do your own thing. Have at it. So if you read between the lines of how collectivists talk, you see that no, they're not okay with leaving other people in freedom and leaving other people in peace. and they will use their bogus terminology and their philosophy as an excuse to be the aggressor and try to force their crappy ideas on you. And that's why there needs to not be a mechanism in society by which their crappy ideas can be forcibly imposed on all the people who don't subscribe to their crappy ideas.